The agenda this week debriefed the election, as well as looked for some advice on making minority parliaments work. Talked to former Minister of Justice Jody Wilson-Raybould about her new book and heard why Canada's foreign policy needs updating. The agenda's week in review begins examining the problem of labor shortages in the province.
Lindsay, have you tried, for example, I don't know what, like offering a few bucks more an hour, raising the potential wages they could earn if they were to come back? You have done that.
Absolutely, yeah. We've raised the wages. Our ownership group has agreed to match the tip out that we normally do anyways. We're out in the country kind of, so you can't take public transit here. So we've even toyed with the idea of paying for people's Ubers back and forth just to get them out here, like literally anything. We've basically exhausted every regular avenue. So,
Rebecca, how about you? Have you tried wage increases?
We have, yeah. We've increased the hourly base pay for our staff. We've added paid sick days that weren't something that we used to do before that were typical in our industry. And I guess those are the two main things that we've done to try and encourage people and make us look more desirable. But we know that all the salons in the city are looking for staff. So it's also there's a lot of places looking.
As I welcome you two to the program, what stands out, Kaylee, among what you just heard? That's obviously a look on the ground. You see the bigger macro picture. What can you add to that?
The one thing that really stands out to me right away is just how much they talked about the uncertainty of whether or not people have transitioned to new industries or what they're doing instead. I think a lot of people have found a way to create employment and income for themselves in places where they weren't looking for it before or didn't know that they could find it. And that's one piece of this puzzle. One thing that I was really curious about, and I'd love to interrogate a little bit more, is when we're talking about job quality, what are the things that are on offer? There was an article recently from the CBC, and it was on Pizzeria Libretto that just talked directly about improving employment quality for their employers or employees and actually being able to find the workers that they needed. So in an industry like hospitality with such a high vacancy rate, that's something that seems like it would work pretty well and shows anecdotally at least that it has so far.
Interesting. Craig, how about you? What stood out?
Well, I think it really summarizes how the hard-hit industries are being affected. And it really highlights how the health risks and the risk that jobs are more precarious. In other words, worries that, the health risk is still out there. The employees are putting themselves at risk, but at the same time, they're also concerned that the job will go away again if there's new government restrictions. The one thing I'd flag, though, is I think that many people appreciate the challenges that hair salons and restaurants and other hard-hit industries, like hotels, et cetera, are experiencing labor shortages. But I would actually argue that those labor shortages are far more broad, that in point of fact, across the entire economy, many sectors, if not most sectors, are experiencing some labor shortages at the moment for a variety of different reasons.
Kaylee, do you want to follow up on your first answer? You think there may be something deeper, more systemic at play here?
Yes. I guess what I've been watching for is wondering how transitions will happen and what will transition over time in the economy as consumer demand has changed. We're looking more to people buying online versus going to stores and ordering food online versus going into a restaurant. How will that settle out in the long term is something we don't know yet, but we will know eventually. And then in terms of just thinking through broader labor shortages, I think that's something that was happening long before the pandemic hit. This is certainly not a new topic.
Now let's go back pre-pandemic. January 2020, the unemployment rate in the province of Ontario was 5.2%. In August 2021, last month, it was 7.6%. 5.2 versus 7.6. How unusual is it in an economy to have a high unemployment rate and a worker shortage at the same time?
The unemployment rate shows you that there is slack in the labor market, that there's people who are looking for jobs but can't find them. And at the same time, we have statistics from StatsCan that shows that in June, there was 815,000 vacant jobs. So we have people without jobs, and we have jobs without people, and that tells you that there's a mismatch happening in the labor market.
John, why was this not a giant waste of time?
Well, because of the last word in your question, Steve, which is time. The election result, which is a healthy Liberal minority, continues the Trudeau government's time in office. And that's really important. The party was going to have to face the electorate sooner or later and seek to extend its mandate. And I think the result is positive. In evaluating whether it was a waste of time from the Liberal perspective, you'd want to ask yourself, compared to what scenario? The Liberals were very nervous about waiting a lot longer because they had rolled out pretty much everything they had to roll out in the spring 2021 budget. So if they had chosen to wait longer, sure, the pandemic would have eased off, some of the irritation level would have come down. But what would the Liberals have had to offer? More new spending? Not more money to throw around. Some dramatic new policy démarche, hard to do without more new spending. So a lot of Liberals with long memories are haunted by what happened in the late 70s when Prime Minister Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, hesitated to call an election that everyone in 1978 said, you should wait till 79. And by 1979, everyone said, oh God, you should have done it back in 78. If you don't have a strong forward offer, you're really backing yourself into a heck of a strategic corner. That's the dilemma that the Prime Minister faced in choosing to call this election. So I think he refreshed his mandate at the right time. And I think people who are talking about how disappointed the Liberals are supposed to be are not seeing the defensive aspects of why this election was called when it was, and concentrating too much on the thirst for a majority, the offensive aspects, which of course have to be factored in. So I think Trudeau got a pretty decent result out of a tricky situation, and he should be pretty happy this morning.
David, the conventional wisdom is this was a status quo election, a big nothing burger. Why would you try to convince people that something wildly exciting happened last night?
Steve, I'd like to be able to say that there was some massive upset to the status quo that makes this more talking fodder. The fact of the matter is, the Liberals banked on that there was a change in public opinion. They banked on the notion that the pandemic leadership would get them the extra seats necessary to give them a 4-year blank check, and that the pandemic had fundamentally reset a lot of the baggage that Mr. Trudeau has accumulated in the past 6 years. That bet didn't pay off. And to John's point, I think Liberals are relieved today. I mean, 3 weeks ago, they were staring at, quite frankly, an electoral defeat. Would have been one of the most catastrophic electoral calls in Canadian history. They escaped that. But they banked on this being a change, and that Trudeau could reap all kinds of plaudits for what he did last summer. And that obviously did not happen. And the fact, if anything changed, it crystallized in a lot of Canadians the reasons why that they don't have the fondness for Mr. Trudeau the way they did 6 years ago, and some of the more negative aspects of his personality and his style of leadership.
Jordan, would you attempt to convince Canadians that this was not a giant waste of time?
Well, I don't think an election is ever a waste of time, but I don't think it was a good night for Mr. Trudeau at all. The only way that this could be considered a real win for him is if we consider it in comparison to the potential scenarios that were emerging in the middle of the campaign. But at the end of the day, he went to the electorate because he wanted to seek a majority mandate. He didn't get that. And in fact, we're now back pretty much where we were before, except he's got a more challenging path ahead of him in this minority parliament. So I think that there should be a lot of soul searching on the part of Liberals about whether this was worth it. And I suspect more than a few of them wish they had a bit of a time machine to pull the plug a little earlier than they did.
Abhijit, where are you on this?
Well, I mean, I saw yesterday on Twitter somebody called it the most expensive cabinet shuffle in Canadian history. And it's, I mean, that's exactly what it was, is a massive waste of time, fueled mostly by hubris and ambition. And I mean, the money involved, $600 million that could have been spent, lifting how many boil water advisories, fueling and funding how many climate action projects. Not to mention, this was during a pandemic. So how many candidates, volunteers, as well as voters were exposed to COVID-19 when they didn't have to? So I think it was an incredibly ill-timed election, and I'm glad that the Canadian electorate sort of chastened the Prime Minister and gave him the same result, saying, go work with the other parties, because that's what minority governments make others do.
I have a bit of a less optimistic view, a pessimistic view. They'll surprise me if they actually pull this off and work together.
Well, let me follow up with you on that, Tonda. Presumably, much of this is helped if the Prime Minister and his most likely dance partner, in this case, I guess, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh, have a decent personal relationship. Do we know if they do?
They don't. Look, Jagmeet Singh just spent 5 weeks prosecuting the case that Justin Trudeau, you couldn't trust him as far as you can throw him. They don't have a good relationship. Since last spring, Jagmeet Singh has been saying that the Liberals never do what they say they're going to do. They haven't had that kind of relationship even through pandemic. I mean, they might sort of respect each other's political skills, and I think they do. But personally, Justin Trudeau told the Star's editorial board that the way Jagmeet Singh has conducted himself in this election has contributed to the cynicism. He's terribly angry that the NDPs went out and campaigned across the country telling everybody that he'd done nothing. And he was very animated when he said, it's not nothing. We've done childcare. We have a real plan on climate change. It's not nothing. And he was actually quite angry about what he called the NDP's misleading on the record and contributing to that public cynicism writ large. So guys, no, there's not a great personal relationship. There's no bromance. They both love social media. They both have an Instagram game, but this is not, going to be a waltz. If anything, this is going to be like a, what do you call it, slam down, breakdown dance or something.
You're real hep with the new terms there. Go ahead, Kate.
So Hugh started this by saying it's time to put the mirror on the desk in the drawer. And I actually kind of hope we see the opposite happen. Campaigning is not governing. We all know that. There will need to be a shift now. The parties, no longer, in my view, have the same incentive around discrediting one another. They know and they've heard the message that there are a very short list of issues that matter a lot. And so, that may have been the dynamic during the campaign, but I cannot help but retain my optimism that we may see a change in the weeks to come.
Well, Hugh Segal, let me follow up with you on that, because one of the reasons that they said that 45 years ago the minority parliaments in Ontario lasted for 6 years and worked as well as they did is that Bill Davis and the then NDP leader Stephen Lewis really got on very well and eventually developed a lifelong friendship. How significant is it in your view that the players actually like each other to make this work?
Well, let's remember that when the majority Conservative government was reduced to a minority in 75, in large measure because Mr. Lewis campaigned so effectively and said some very, very tough things about the Davis government, that did not spawn the relationship of working together in mutual respect. That developed afterwards. When Mr. Lewis was leader of the opposition, Mr. Davis was a minority premier. The Liberals had been reduced to third place, which is always happy for New Democrats and Conservatives. And on that basis, the relationship was built. So I don't disagree with Tonda's analysis at all, but I wouldn't presume that the nature of the dynamic going forward will be always limited by what it's been up until Election Day. Because all of these leaders have seen the message, they've heard it. If they have competent pollsters, it'll be explained to them. Then the issue is, what do you do now? And you can't make progress through sustained tactical animosity. It doesn't get you anywhere, and that's the choice they have to make.
Dave Cook, you want in on that?
Could I just pop in there for a sec? Let's also remember in 1977, Stephen resigned as leader. And so for the largest part of minority government, Michael Cassidy was the leader of the NDP. And if I remember correctly, I don't think that Michael Cassidy and Bill Davis were best of friends. The reality in that 4 years was the NDP had a new leader. And I would say, as a member of that caucus, we were not overly optimistic of how well that leader was going to be leading us and take us into the next election. So we did not want an election. The Liberals didn't want an election. So the dynamic really was, we got to do everything we can to work as well as we can with the government and avoid an election. So it was quite a different dynamic than, say, when Stephen and Mr. Davis were there together.
Okay, here's the cabinet swearing in. I mean, that was a lovely moment of Canada swearing in its first ever Indigenous Justice Minister. What were you thinking at that moment?
Well, I mean, aside from my knees knocking together and being nervous, recognizing that the eyes of many of the eyes of the country were on me, at that moment I felt tremendous pride. I was overcome with emotion in terms of what that moment meant, of course, to me and my family, and more broadly than that, but in particular, what it meant to Indigenous peoples. Being sworn in as the first Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada that is Indigenous meant something. It meant something for the country in terms of how far we have come. So I had great hope and optimism, and a lot has transpired since that picture was taken to you and I talking. But I want to say I still have hope and I still have optimism, but it's that in between space in terms of the years and my experience within government and my experience with speaking up and speaking the truth that I sought to relay in this book in terms of lessons that I've learned, lessons around how government operates and how we can work more diligently towards improving our system of government and good governance and moving away from partisanship. So I hope that through the writing of this book and telling of my story that others can learn from that and we can continue to improve as a country.
Did you ever imagine that a few years after that quite lovely picture, you would say to that man, "I wish I'd never met you"? That's what you say in the book.
I never thought that. I mean, I do talk about some warning signs in terms of some of the interactions and experiences that I had early on, but I was overcome with a desire to do what we promised to do, to change the culture of politics, to be a government by cabinet. And, I know I wasn't the only one. In thinking back to the feeling in 2015 and the people that were around me on my campaign, so many expressed that same sense of hope and that same optimism that we can actually engage in discussions in a different way. So, talking about that line in the book where I said to Justin Trudeau that I wish I had never met him, that's how I felt in the moment. But I would not change the experience I had almost 6 years being incredibly honored to have been the Member of Parliament for Vancouver Granville, and for 3 of those years being a Minister of the Crown, an extraordinary honor by any measure. And I certainly look back on my experience and realize that everything happens for a reason. And I'm still the same person I was who decided to transition from Indigenous politics to federal politics, and getting involved, having more people from marginalized communities getting involved matters, because different voices matter. And in terms of speaking up, I will continue to do that, because we need more people to speak up, because that's how our systems improve.
Jody, everybody remembers, of course, that your relationship with the PM fell apart over SNC Lavalin. You were the Justice Minister and Attorney General at the time. You believed that he and his people were inappropriately trying to influence your independence, that you felt you needed, and in fact, legally you had to do your job in the way that you did it. We don't need to relitigate the whole SNC-Lavalin thing here, to be sure, but for those who don't understand the significance of what your concerns were, what exactly is the problem with a prime minister, a Montreal MP to boot, trying to use his good offices to try to make sure that a company that hires 9,000 people in the province of Quebec gets every break?
Well, I mean, I was the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General of Canada, and those are two very distinct roles. As the Attorney General, I am responsible, or the Attorney General is responsible for overseeing prosecutions in this country. And I understood my job very clearly. And while jobs are important and ensuring people have well-paying jobs is something that we all want to aspire to, there are basic fundamental tenets in our democracy, including having the independence of the judicial system, independence of the prosecution, and as the Attorney General, overseeing that and ensuring that there is no political interference in how one prosecutes particular cases, underscores that, and ensuring that the rule of law is upheld.
Joe Biden, the American president, said the United States has no more reliable ally in the world than Australia. I mean, Adam, he used to say that kind of stuff about us. What's going on here?
Well, it's interesting because this announcement doesn't bother me nearly as much as some of the other things that the panelists are talking about. In this case, Australia had a deal with France to buy submarines, and they didn't like it. They found a better deal with the United States, didn't seem to tell the French all that much about it. The Americans brought the British in. They signed a new pact. They added some nice words around it to make it more than just a pact. But the French took it as a stab in the back. In this case, I don't want to see Canada in the middle of a disagreement between some of its most important allies. I'm actually quite happy that we're outside of this. Not that I'm surprised that we're outside of it, but this isn't one of those things where we really want to be in the middle. We need the United States, France, Australia, the United Kingdom to get along. We can't have them fighting, and being on one side or the other doesn't get rid of this fight.
No, I appreciate that. But Lauren, this seems like a fairly significant new development, a new institution in international affairs. Most of the allies seem to have been caught off guard by the fact it happened, and we're not part of it. Is that problematic?
I mean, I would agree with Adam that, yes, it was what it was. No, it wasn't ideal from a number of reasons. But when you look at the last 2 years, it does not surprise me that you're seeing these increasingly fractured alliances. You're seeing, if we start from the start of COVID, where what we needed was international solidarity and we needed some leadership. People talk about leadership in a very ephemeral, throw the word around way. But we needed a group of people who are in charge and have been elected to make hard decisions, coming together and say, this is a frightening time. Here's what we're going to do together. Here's how we're going to get through it. And instead, we just had everybody for themselves, these very sort of tactical and self-interested trading of vaccines, for example, or short-term allegiances for domestic reasons. And you've seen that continue. You saw the G7 as well at odds and fractured, even without Trump in place. And so, no, it doesn't surprise me that 18 months after that, we're continuing to fracture, and with these short-termist alliances for domestic reasons, it's a pattern that's likely to continue, I would guess.
Gary, can I get you on that? Does it say anything of significance to the fact that we didn't know about this, we're not part of it, and yet here it is?
Well, I think I'd split the difference between Adam and Lauren. I think you can't ignore that part of this is actually about a nuclear submarine deal. There are some issues around military procurement. There's some straight business interest, dollars and cents issues around that aspect of it. You can't deny that. That's absolutely part of it. But the other side of it too is this area around information sharing. And for a long time, there's been accusations that Canada hasn't been doing this part. I read a recent piece by Stephanie Carvin, who talked about Canada's involvement in the Five Eyes community, which is the three countries we've talked about, plus Canada and New Zealand. And for a long time, Australia has been playing a much more leading role in information sharing and active role in the Five Eyes, maybe than Canada has been. And that requires investment and taking part in it. I think what is more concerning from an allied standpoint, and hearing Biden's comments, is that increasingly there are a number of regional forums around the world, whether it's the Quad, whether it's other forums, where Canada has remained disinterested. And my former colleague, Howard Anglin, who was Deputy Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Harper and worked a lot on foreign policy issues as well, said, as Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau has shown little interest in strategic defense or geopolitics. That means that Canada's foreign policy has largely been left to the gray men and women of the Pearson Building. The problem with this approach is that you stop showing up for your friends, eventually they stop inviting you. And I think that is some wise words that are worth considering when we talk about this new alliance.
Bess, I see you nodding your head. You think we're just not worth inviting to these parties anymore?
Yeah, sort of. I mean, what are we bringing to the table, frankly? And I really don't think this is just about nuclear-powered subs. What's on the table here is really fundamental. It's about emerging technologies. We're talking about artificial intelligence. We're talking about quantum, cybersecurity, even industrial policy, talking about supply chains. I mean, this is a very comprehensive pact. And I think the fact that we're excluded says a lot. And frankly, this is not a time when we should be not just only excluded, but, sort of shortchanging our own investment in these issues. This is the wave of the future. It is like investing in the internet, 25 years ago, thinking, it's okay if other people do it, we don't have to do it. It's not that way. We need to put more into this. So I think the emerging technology piece is key. This is where we need to put more money in it. And the fact that we are excluded, I think says something about the fact that, Canada doesn't bring a lot to the table.
That's just some of what we covered this week on The Agenda. For more, including the full conversations, you can visit our website, tvo.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.